And we're back. We're back and excited. Many of you guys may be used to dealing with shops that sort of have an identity. Maybe a shop that's a drop bar shop, a shop that's all about free ride, about bike packing, whatever. If our shop was going to be identified as anything, and I'm talking about Bike Bros in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada, if our shop was going to be identified as anything, it would be a trail bike shop. We are looking for bikes that help people who just want to go on long rides, do big loops, maybe be a little bit silly on the descents, but essentially for riders who go up and down on their bikes. So today is an exciting episode for us because we're looking at the brand new 2024 Giant Trance X2. Hey bike geeks, from weight to wheels, price to performance, we're here to take a close look at bicycles so you can make an educated decision when selecting your next bike. In today's video, we're looking at the new 2024 Giant Trance X2. So we'll first do a little bit of a destruction. I don't want to be doing any destructions. So at first we'll be doing a little bit of a description of the Trance lineup of bikes. The Trance in general from Giant is their trail lineup, but there is a Trance without any letters or anything else after it. That Trance would be a 120 rear, 130 front millimeter travel bike. That would still be a trail bike, suitable for half up, half down, just for an attitude that likes something a little bit more efficient and maybe a little bit more poppy. Once we move up to the Trance X, this means we're looking now for 2024 at 140 millimeters of rear travel. That's up 5 millimeters from last year, and a 150 millimeter travel fork. The travel numbers, I don't think 5 millimeters matters that much between last year's and this new version, but there are some other features about this bike and improvements in the sizing that do make this new 2024 version of the Trance X of particular interest. And then above this Trance X is a thing called a Trance SX. That is the mullet specific 145/160 bike. So that, while it could still be a trail bike, I would say it's a little bit of a freerider's trail bike, with the idea of going to the mullet on that bike being about basically a little bit more aggressive cornering and maybe being able to throw some shapes while you're doing jumps. So in today's video, we're in the middle of those three different bikes and at the first price point with this Trance X2. If you're new here and this seems like a weird format for a video, well, it probably is. You're dealing with a bicycle shop owner. I own Bike Bros in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. And these videos, the whole point of these things is to take a close look at the details that either if you're looking at a magazine review on a bike or something like a pink bike review, you typically in those cases get a bunch of flashy images and a brief synopsis on a bike, but you don't get to see close-ups, details, any of those other things that really are helpful when you're trying to make a decision about a bike. So if you're new, if you're kind of into bikes or wanting to get into bikes and wanting to understand bikes that much better, A, like the video, and B, subscribe, because I try and do this largely on a lot of mountain bikes, but we do touch on some gravel bikes and some city bikes as well, ones that are of interest and offer interesting enough features that we think that they need to be pointed out to you. So welcome if you're new. Welcome back if you're not new, and we're about to take a look at the details about the specifications on this Trance X and some of the new features and some sizing details that matter on this new Trance X2. So one interesting feature about this Trance X2 is the fact that we have it here at $38.99. That's a Canadian price. There is no price or no mention of this bike if you look on the Giant USA website. This is showing a little bit of a difference between the Canadian and the US markets in that I think in Canada our distributors have cleaned out enough of the 2023 models that they feel okay and they see the importance of bringing this new bike in, while in the States They only bring in the Trance X1, which is a slightly up-spec version of this bike. So a lot of this info will be still useful to you. And then they've only brought in the two highest end on the Advanced, which is the carbon version of this bike. This bike, this is a size medium. It weighs 34.3 pounds, so it's not light, but it also isn't getting up into the high 30-pound range, which is where a lot of enduro bikes are these days. And speaking of enduro, I think for a lot of local enduros, if you're not in a place like Whistler or Squamish with really gnarly trails, I suspect that somebody could use this as a daily rider and go do the occasional enduro. The geometry is probably one of my favorite geometries I've seen over the years. They really are sort of narrowing in on what works really well, and then with some of the new features on this bike, they're now making it easier for riders to size the bike to fit their body proportions, and then also to get the quality of ride or the ride that actually suits their riding preferences. So the usual thing that I do in these videos is I'll show you close-ups and describe some things, and then I'm going to talk about those features and the geometry stuff as we go through it. So to start with, we have awesome tires on this bike. The Maxxis Dissector is a very common, fast-rolling, all trail conditions, sort of a rear tire, 29 by 2.4 with EXO casing, and of course it is a tubeless ready tire, and Giant being one of the few companies that actually sets the tires up tubeless for us, ships it with sealant. So when we build the bike, we put in the sealant and you're actually set up tubeless from the get-go. The front tire is a Maxxis DHF. So of course the DHF means that is the front version. It's a 2.5, once again that EXO casing and set up tubeless. With the fact that these are both EXO casing tires, one of the interesting things is that leads into being able to discuss the wheels that are on this bike. On all of the new Trance X's, they're using a new style of rim. On these alloy ones, they're alloy rims. On the carbon bikes, they get carbon rims. But one of the fancy things that they're doing on those rims is making a really wide sort of top edge surface right there, which is helping the tire basically to not need as heavy a sidewall casing to prevent cuts in the sidewall if you actually bottom out against a rock or anything. So what we're talking about is the fact that the inside of the rim is 30 millimeters, the outside is 40 millimeters. If you do the math, that means we have basically a 5 millimeter shelf that when the tire goes flat, it's going flat against something like that, not sort of going against a knife edge of a rim. So that is both good for the rim strength and for the tire not getting cut. We're of course looking at standard things these days. There's a UDH rear hanger. That means that if you wanted to run SRAM transmission derailleur, you could, and of course all the other derailleurs work on there. Boost spacing, and we're looking at a Dior 12-speed drivetrain, and that's including both the Dior cassette and rear derailleur. Of course, that's a clutched rear derailleur that is a little bit less of a talking point these days because virtually everything on a real mountain bike has a clutch of some sort. We are going up to Praxis Cadet cranks, 165 millimeter on small and then 170 in all the other sides, and their particular version of the narrow wide style chainring there. As we look from the side here, we can see the heart of any high-end Giant bike that isn't an Anthem is going to be the fact that we're using the Maestro short dual link patented suspension design. What happens on these things is so there's a link basically here, there's a link here, we get a virtual point in space about here, which is where the virtual pivot is. As this whole rear end moves, this virtual pivot will basically migrate. Part of what that's doing is when your virtual pivot is around here, you get a fair amount of chain growth or anti-squat. So that's really handy at the beginning of the pedal stroke. As you go further through the pedal stroke, if you keep on having a lot of anti-squat all the way through, that's when you can have pedal kickback as your suspension compresses. So with that migrating spot in space there, as it goes closer, your anti-squat is actually reducing. And so that's what gives us a really efficient bike that doesn't get that pedal kickback, and we don't have to go into the sort of on-trend thing of having a pulley up here and a high pivot and all that sort of stuff. This is a simple way to basically get efficiency, not having the kickback, and also not getting crazy pedal jack, which apparently some of the high pivot bikes are actually struggling with a bit. And what that is when your brakes are being applied at speed, your brakes are affecting the way your suspension wants to move, and causing the rear end to stiffen up or to want to rise out of its travel. In this case, braking, pedaling, suspension are all about as independent as you can ask. Now, one of the things I'd seen on some riding reviews on this bike is that the kinematics has been adjusted just a little bit, with the idea being that it is not trying to be so efficient that when you're pedaling you actually feel ultra firm. What'll happen in that instance, which apparently the last Trance X had on it and this one has less of, but if you go too firm when you're pedaling, you actually miss out on some of the benefits of your suspension system when you're climbing, and that is that your rear wheel can spin out a bit more easily. In this case, you'll see your linkage up here moving just a touch as you're pedaling, but that is actually a sign that your rear wheel is getting really, really good traction if you happen to be climbing in loose, bumpy terrain. So excellent suspension design. That Maestro's system is the heart of that whole thing. Now, looking at the shape of this bike, I'm sort of pulled back to give you a nice profile. One of the biggest things, and it shouldn't be, but the aesthetics of this bike, we now have this really nice straight top tube with a subtle little gusset here, instead of what was sort of a long going thing with Giant, which was that sort of arcing top tube here. So I think just aesthetics wise, this is a really pleasing look. Your top tube is roughly the same sort of angle as your seat stays. It has freed up so that this little cargo tool mounting spot here gets you a nice amount of room if you were going to put your tube up here, maybe a little multi-tool CO2, something like that. On the down tube then, we also have, even on an aluminum frame, we have a cargo door. So on here, we have a really simple way that we can shove some stuff inside the frame. This door that's on here isn't huge. So that's the only criticism that I've seen. I can't comment on it a heck of a lot because I still, even though I'm on my second, I'm riding the carbon version of this bike right now and just gotten my first couple rides. But I still haven't gotten in the habit of using this thing for anything except for basically making a joke, because I rode last year's BC bike race on the new Trance, which has this Trance Advanced, not the X version. And I think I had a couple candies in there and a chain link. So I basically wasn't using it, but I just wanted to make a joke of the fact that that's all I was using it for. The fact that I can put that door on with one hand is a good sign as to how easy this whole thing is to operate. Another good thing is you don't get any sense, like when you have your bottle on here, I have a bottle and a 1-up pump and tool all in one sort of strapped onto this. That extra weight still doesn't result in any sort of knocking, cracking noises, anything like that. So this is pretty sealed up. And even when I've washed my bike, a lot of water running over it, I'm not getting any signs that there's water that's actually getting inside. So there's a few things about this, even though it's a small door on there, it is doing its job really well. And what I like actually is with my bottle cage and everything on there, it's still really easy to use this knob. It's below the end of your cage, and you can pull this thing off with your bottle and your pump or whatever still mounted on there, and get into your little down tube door. Now on this bike, an interesting feature, being an alloy bike, this top bit here is actually carbon. I think Giant just sees the fact that if they're going to make carbon, for the carbon bike, and if the dimensions are going to be the same, they'll just stick a carbon top link on this one anyways. Going back, this is one of the new things. The old version of the Trance X had a 2-position flip chip. We now have a 3-position flip chip. The overall amount of flippity-chippity that's going on is the same, but we do have that in-between mount, and that is basically what Giant recommends unless you're looking for sort of a slacker or a steeper setup. So you're starting with that, but they send you little things like that, which depending on if they're run facing up or facing down, that's where you get your extra amount of flippity-chippity stuff happening. Also, we've got the new Giant contact switch AT. The AT stands for adjustable travel. So this is a Giant dropper post. Works really well, has a nice firm top out. Doesn't tend to have any more or less wiggle waggle up top here. And a nice thing, that AT, the adjustable travel part, basically you can adjust the travel of this thing by up to 30 millimeters. So it comes in its longest setting, which I wish I did or remembered my homework. I think that's got to be starting at least a 180. It's a pretty long dropper post. On top there is the Giant Romero saddle, which for being a stock saddle is actually pretty good. I would say it's on par with something like a WTB Volt as far as suiting that many people's butts. There are still people that don't get along with WTB Volts, just like people won't get along with this, but many people will get along with that as a stock saddle. So it's a nice thing that you don't have to start by taking off some heinously uncomfortable saddle that nobody likes. You've at least got a chance that this thing is going to make your butt happy. The frame itself has quite a long section of straight tube here, of seat tube, so you can run your long droppers fairly deep into the frame without having any issues. We've got standard stuff these days, like the internal cable routing. They've got at least these a little bit more sophisticated ports than the old rubber push-in thingies that half the time you turn your bars and your little push-in rubber port would want to pop out. As we're up at this part of the bike, we're awfully close to having a look at that. So this is the second part of the adjustment on this bike, is we now have a set of adjustable headset cups. This is not about being an angle adjust, this is about being a reach adjust. So once again, with a new bike here, it's shipped in the neutral setting, but you get this set of 2 offset cups which run forward or backwards, will either add or decrease this reach number, so from your saddle to your handlebars by about 5 millimeters. And so we now have a nice way that it's really shortening the gap between sizes. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that some of the sizing and geometry stuff has been improved. I would say a dramatic one would be the fact that between the medium and the large, in combination with using your headset adjusting cups, you basically only have 10 millimeters of reach between the longest that a medium could be and the shortest a large could be. And that is a drastic improvement over the previous version of this bike, where there really looked like about 30 millimeters of no man's land between the medium and the large. So now the biggest gaps are from small to medium or from large to extra large, but where the bulk of riders are and where people often are tending to feel like they're sort of stranded between sizes, I think that this new way that they're doing it is solving that fairly well. To give an idea, on the large version of this bike, the middle setting on your rear flip chips and your neutral setting, you're at about 480 millimeters reach. You're at 460 on a medium. So once again, you shorten that with the headset cup by 5 on the large, lengthen by 5 on the medium, and that's where you end up with a 465 to 475 gap between the two sizes. So in general, if you're thinking about this bike, because the geometry thing, it can tend to be really overwhelming for people. We've been selling Rocky Mountains with their Ride 9 thing for years, and the number of people, even who I would call like really high-end riders, quite used to a lot of things on their bikes, they were basically intimidated to play with their Ride 9, and that Ride 9 was doing much of what we're seeing on that 3-position flip chip there. So I would say that don't be intimidated. If you're at this level, I imagine that this is probably your step up into your first true performance bike, and it is exactly that. Try playing. It's quite easy playing with those things there and not too much harder to play with the headset stuff. Even come into the shop if you bought this bike, and if you're curious, see what a little bit of a longer or a shorter reach would feel like, and see what a slacker bike or a taller bike would fit like. I would say one practical spot where this comes up is the fact that I do still hear from riders, and I think it's honestly partly a technique thing, but riders who really struggle with pedal strikes when they're riding through really bumpy, rooty, rocky terrain. So that's a little bit of wanting to learn just when to time your pedaling and your pedal strokes. But also, if you happen to struggle with that, the detriment as far as your bike getting a touch steeper versus raising your cranks 5 millimeters by going from this current middle setup to the tall setup, it might be something that's worth trying for you, because I personally think a pedal strike is one of the more dangerous things that can happen to you, especially pedaling at speed. I know I have been probably 10 feet in the air, ejection wise, catching a pedal at high speed on a really bad route. So once again, back to the componentry on here. This is a Fox Float Performance shock. So this is doing all the things that we need a rear shock to do. It's an air shock, so we can set the sag to work exactly for your body weight. The red knob here is your rebound adjustment. So after we set the air weight, we're going to set that to make sure that your shock is rebounding in an appropriately controlled manner compared to how hard your shock is for your weight. And then this lever here is now a 2-position switch. As it points towards me, that is the trail mode. What that does is it's not a lockout, but it's sort of 20% towards being a lockout. It's just a firmer setting. As it points away from me, that would be your setting, what I just call open. Being a huge fan of Giant's Maestro suspension system, and being a huge fan of getting your rear suspension to actually help with your climbing traction and comfort, and I've been riding Giants for years and years and years, I essentially ride my bike in the open position all the time, unless I end up on a loop where I'm doing some hard cranking, say on pavement, and when mostly psychologically going into that mode and not seeing this little bit of wiggle in the linkage here when you're pushing hard, that's about the only time I'll ever flip into that trail mode. So it's a feature, but it is a feature that is not a necessary feature, where many other bikes that have a shock like this, it is being used as a band-aid to make up for the fact that the rear suspension design is not 100% mechanically efficient. So just a thing to keep in mind. Focusing more on details here, we have excellent down tube protection. Underneath here, we have some really, really thick see-through 3M type protection. This would be largely if you're using the bike as a shuttle bike and it's going to be hanging on a tailgate. That protects your paint under here. And then we have a really thick, really long rubber guard that goes all the way to the back of your bottom bracket there. Giant tells us that they've even increased the quality of the adhesive that holds this stuff on. So unlike, I can think of a couple generations ago on some Giant Reigns where it felt like if you sneezed really hard on the right day, you could start getting this thing to peel off. Apparently this stuff is glued on that much more effectively now. Moving forward, we go to this fork. This is a Fox 36 Rhythm. So the 36 is your stanchion diameter. So this is the same stanchion diameter overall layout, 44 mil offset as any of the high-end Performance Elite factory forks. It even has the same arch shape on here. which is interesting because I don't think that the rhythm fork on my advanced version of this bike has that arch shape. So maybe just a thing with a generation of the fork, but the same arch shape as a factory fork even. The same general stuff that you even have these bleeder ports in the back of the legs here. They don't have the bleeders in there. That's for built up air pressure that you might get inside, and they're usually only a thing that sort of high-end users even find any value in, but it's got that there. The only thing about this bike that is really different from a performance version of a Fox 36 is the fact that this arch here is just going to be, it's not quite as sophisticated, so maybe you're carrying around an extra 50 grams or something like that. We still have a standard grip damper on here. With a grip damper, that means that in this position we have a wide open compression valve, which means that it's the equivalent of that sort of thing. And as we close it all the way there, we basically have it locked out, and you do get some sense of an in-between feeling in the in-between setting on there. The other side has your air valve. On the bottom here, that black knob that we see there, that is your rebound adjustment. So once again, just like the rear shock, when this bike is being set up, we set your air pressure to match both your weight and your riding style. And from there, we then set your rebound adjustment so that your fork is going to have a controlled rebound back to the norm. This just shows the fact that it's got the new through axle style pinch bolt here. So now taking out through axles is a two-part process. You need to loosen off that thing just a turn or two, just to take the pressure off your through axle. Then you just turn that and it'll just yank right out. As I was just talking about geometry and things, seat tube angle on this, and of course we have so many levels of adjustment, I just give roundabouts. It's about a 77-degree seat tube angle, plus or minus, depending on your flip chips. Your head tube angle in the neutral position is just shy of 65 degrees. I think it's about 64.8. That's about 1.5 degrees shallower, slacker than the previous version of this bike. So that kind of, along with the stuff I was talking about with the way that the suspension is sort of plushened up a little bit, this bike has taken a bit of a turn towards being a bit more, I wouldn't say focused on descending, because that to me makes it seem like it is losing out on its climbing abilities. I still think that this is a 50-50 bike. It's just designed so that in that 50-50, and when I say that, it means a bike that is trying to balance its attributes to be a good climber, good descender. I still think that this is a 50-50, a true trail bike, meant for ups and for downs. Handlebars are 800 millimeters wide. They're Giant's in-house alloy handlebars. Stem length is either 50 or 40 or 50 millimeters, depending on if it's a small or medium or a large, extra large. So I believe 40 millimeters in this case. Grips are these Giant in-house grips. They're actually a pretty nice design, although I do find them to be quite short in length. But they do at least have a little bit of design thought put into them, sort of some extra stuff here so that your fingertips grab on them well. The brakes on this bike are the Shimano 420 brakes. So this is the highest level before we step up to the servo wave style levers. And we know that when we get to servo wave, because they tend to have a stubbier little lever. There are a number of reviews out there with reviewers who are very pleasantly surprised by the overall power of these brakes. They're still quite a good brake. If anybody was looking for a thing that they had to upgrade on here, I suspect that brakes would be one of the things, but I don't think that it is necessary from performance in many cases. Just the fact that this seems to be a place where people like to nerd out a little bit and maybe go with a higher spec of brake, but still an excellent brake. Those brakes are clamping onto the 4-piston brakes, just so you know. You can see sort of the 2 bulges on the back of that caliper down there. A 203 front rotor, 180 rear rotor. These rotors are actually in the SLX level of quality. So these unlike some of these previous bikes at this level, these rotors are metallic or resin brake pad compatible. On a lot of other bikes in this level, they put on cheaper rotors that just can't handle the extra friction or heat of metallic brake pads. So this means that for people who want to upgrade the brake pads in there, they will not be forced into upgrading their rotors to get those brake pads to actually work without wrecking things. Going back, I just noticed from this side, I never talked about it, it is a press fit bottom bracket, not a threaded bottom bracket on this bike. But for those people who get all wound up about that detail, our experience with these press fit bottom brackets, it's probably both the execution, the fact that Giant has round bottom bracket shells and doesn't put excess stress on the press fit bottom bracket, and the particular model of press fit bottom bracket as compared to some of the ones that I think Specialized and maybe some other brands used early on. These tend to last pretty darn well. So while I still prefer, just because I like nerding out and I quite often change cranks on bikes and having to knock out a set of bearings and then press in a new set rather than spinning them out, isn't my favorite thing to do. As far as performance, if you're not going to be upgrading cranks or upgrading them often, there is nothing to be concerned about on a press fit bottom bracket. I'm just going to come back up here too, but I just want to talk, this is something I just thought of. We just got the newest Rocky Mountain Instincts and Altitudes in. Excuse me. They have adjustable headset cups similar to this. The funny thing is, on their carbon frames they use this oval shape. On their alloy frames they use an oversized round shape that can be run either way. When I first saw those, I hadn't seen any of these Giants come in, and in my head I thought, oh, it's because it's an alloy frame, it's probably really hard to machine an oval into an alloy head tube on a frame precisely enough that you wouldn't have any issues with this. The fact that we now see this with Giant means that I think somewhere at Giant, because they are the world's biggest bike manufacturer, they can do things maybe a little bit better than some other brands, especially when it's for their own Giant brand. Giant does manufacture bikes for a number of different brands out there. And that is partly how they get their value, is that they're a true manufacturer as opposed to a design house that just sends mechanical design pictures or plans or whatever off to an outsourced manufacturer. So this has been the 2024 Giant Trance X2. I think it is a banger of a bike. If you're tempted by a lot of bikes that are on sale this year, don't be thrown off too much. You might very well see a bike that is, say, regular $4,800 from last year or the year before from one of the other big brands out there on sale for a similar price. Have a close look at all the details. As much as that $38.99 that is on this bike is a regular price, I would not be surprised if it is still as good, if not a better overall use of your dollar than saving $1,000 on a bike either with a spec that isn't as completely awesome as this one, or that doesn't have a frame with the same sort of suspension quality, build quality, or adjustability as this one. So that is the end of another one of the Bike Bros bike review videos. I hope you found this useful. I know I've been yammering even longer than I usually yammer about a bike, but I just wanted to give the most thorough information possible for an actual prospective buyer, not somebody just looking to be entertained for 3 minutes and 28 seconds or whatever. Awesome bike. It'd be a great choice. There is a second color in this bike. They call it Sandstorm. Looks to me like an awesome orange, and I would probably be tempted by that bike. I'm looking forward to seeing the first one when it comes in person, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Have a great riding season in 2024, guys. Cheers.